Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at getting a database connection via a method that supports connection pooling and basically is just a better way of connecting than the way that we saw in the last tutorial. So in the last tutorial we looked at creating this database connection, which we haven't actually used yet for any queries, but we will get onto that. But we created a database connection by putting some code in a servlet in a do-get method that does this drivermanager.get connection stuff. Now the main problem with that is, as far as I'm aware, that if your servlets crash and they don't connect, they don't close the connection, then there's no kind of timeout for the connection, and there's no kind of connection pooling or reuse of connections. And I think that's the reason why this isn't really considered to be the best way to get a connection to a database. And the best way is in fact to use a JNDI data source. That's Java Naming and Directory Interface data source. So we're going to look at how to do that in this tutorial. It's probably best if you just paste this code in and adapt it for your database and your user and password before going on to try a JNDI connection, because JNDI is a little bit more, it can be a little bit harder to debug, and if you don't have the correct jar files in the correct place, as we saw in the last tutorial, then you won't be able to get a connection via this method either. So in the last tutorial we saw that you've got to have this, if you're using MySQL for example, you've got to have a MySQL connector jar file in the lib directory of your Tomcat installation, and you've got to have it in the build path of your project. And the same applies to this, at least as far as I know, so it's worth getting this working first. Now I actually noticed since the last tutorial that there are some differences between the older versions of Eclipse and this version, which is actually the Juno release of Eclipse, and Juno doesn't seem to include a MySQL connector by default when you run it, whereas the version I was using before did. So you just need to follow the instructions from the last tutorial about making sure you've got your appropriate connector.jar for your database in the right places there. So I'll assume that you've gone through that tutorial and that everything's working fine, and let's now have a look at how to set up a JNDI data source connection. So I'm going to create a new servlet here, and by the way there's something else I should mention actually, which is the older versions of Eclipse. When you create a dynamic web project, they automatically give you in your web content there's a webinf directory and there's a web.xml in there, whereas the newer versions, or certainly Juno onwards, appear not to give you that by default, and you're going to need that for this tutorial, so make sure your project has that. And the way to do that is when you create a new dynamic web project. Let's see if I can create a test one here. Let's just call it temp and go to next, and next you need to tick this generate web.xml deployment descriptor so that you get that web.xml. But if you're already getting it anyway, then don't worry about this, because who knows, the designers of Eclipse may take this out again in the next version. So as long as you've got that web.xml, then you can carry on with this tutorial. So I'm going to create a new servlet here. I'm going to right click my database project here and go to new servlet here, and let's call this, let's put it in the demo package again, and let's call it data source. That's as good a name as any, and let's call it data source demo actually. So I'll click next, and I'm going to make sure as well that I've got the init method which we're actually going to be using for once in this tutorial. And let's click finish. I think that's everything that I need. So let's click finish. And let's just run that and check that we can get a blank servlet. And I also actually noticed that Juno likes to cache your files, so you can change a file and click run and it runs the old version. And if you do have problems with that, you can always go to project clean, and that will clean out your class files, and then you can just run the project and it will build your classes from scratch. So let's just run this and see if this works. There we go, it's a nice blank servlet. I always like to check that because you never know that something's got misconfigured, and it's good to find it out at the start. And now when you add a JNDI data source, you basically configure that as a data source. A data source is a thing that you can get a database connection from, and you configure that in your application server. And we're going to take Tomcat as an example here, but I'll show you how to find out for yourself what you need to do for your web server in case you want to use a different one. And in the next tutorial we'll look at an example of deploying to an app engine on the internet using a data source. But here I'm going to look at Tomcat, and I don't carry this stuff around in my head, and anyway it changes from version of Tomcat to Tomcat. So I'm going to go to Google here and I'm going to type JNDI Tomcat 7, because I've got Tomcat 7 at the moment, data source. There we go, and let's have a look at this, and you can see that this page comes up, and plenty like it. Apache Tomcat 7 JNDI data source how to, and this is a fine page. And now I'm going to click on, I'm using MySQL, so I'm going to click on this here, and so I've got a connector that's working. They've kind of tested certain versions, or certain versions have been reported of the connector as working with this, but I found that it works fine usually with the latest connector, so don't worry too much unless you actually do have problems. And we've got some stuff on MySQL configuration here, but basically the upshot is you need to have a MySQL database running as in the last tutorial, and you've got to have a user that has the right to get into that database. And I've got that. I've got here a, if I just quit this, you can see that I've got a user called web app with a password hello, which can connect to a MySQL database called WebShop. Well, actually it can connect to MySQL. And if I do show databases, there's a WebShop database there with, I've just got, I think I put one table in it, but we're not going to use that in this tutorial. We'll look at actually doing queries in future, but I just want to connect in this tutorial. So let's assume you've got your MySQL stuff database configured, and now here's the tricky bit, and the bit that that I can never remember because it's a load of stuff like this. Basically you've got to edit two files, and there's a context.xml for Tomcat that you need to edit in your Tomcat server, and there's a web.xml as we just saw in your project, or there should be, and you need to edit that as well. Now let's take a look. So this is within the context tag in Tomcat, and if I go back to Eclipse here, and you'll find that you've actually got a project called servers which needs to be open to run anything. And if you look in there, we've got a kind of local configuration here of Tomcat for debugging purposes, and Tomcat has this context.xml, and if you right click that, and I don't want to use the default editor here, so I'm going to right click it and I'm going to go to open with text editor, and here we can see this is an XML file, but if you look carefully you see that it's basically a load of comments, and there is somewhere in here there's a start context tag, and there's a closing context tag. So we're going to add some configuration in here. Let's go back to Google now, and the bit that I need to add, these are actually all comments which you can paste in if you want to, but the bit that we need is this bit down here where it says resource name such and such. I'm just going to Control C to copy that, and I'm going to go to my Tomcat context.xml, paste that in, I think Control-Shift-F might work here. Let's try it. Maybe it doesn't. Okay, well that's okay. And now I need to change this as appropriate for my database. So my database here is called Web Shop and the user is Web App. So here I'm going to change this to my database name, Web Shop, and this all looks fine. My username here, as you can see, you can configure some things like the maximum number of simultaneous connections you can have and that kind of thing, and the timeout, which is really what makes this valuable, in that there's a timeout on the connection so that connections don't get used up, because if they do get used up, MySQL and other databases will start refusing new connections, and that's why this is really a useful technology. But here, username I need to change, and in my case I've set up a user called Web App, and it's worth checking this really carefully, because if you make a mistake here it just won't work and you might not know why. I remember in my days as a web developer, I used to really tear my hair out configuring this kind of stuff, but it has improved a lot in the past years. Now the password here I've got set to hello, which of course you should never use, it's too insecure, but for tutorial purposes it's hello. And you'll see this is the driver that we saw from the last tutorial, com.mysql.jdbc.driver, and of course that you need to have the appropriate jar file that contains this driver, as we saw last time. And now here's the URL, JDBC URL, that we also used in the last tutorial, and so it's going to be JDBC MySQL, because I'm using MySQL here, localhost 3306, because by default MySQL runs on port 3306 and it's on my local computer here. But if you're if you're working in some corporation somewhere, this is probably not going to be localhost, unless you just want to run stuff locally. And this is my database name here, and mine is actually set to Web Shop. So I'm going to save that, and now we're done with this servers project configuration. So let's just close that down and go back to Google, and now the next bit is the web.xml file in my project, and I need some stuff in that, and the bit that I need actually is this resource-ref bit. I'm just going to copy that. You'll see this is all in a tag called web-app, but if we go and look at web.xml here in my project, so here's my database project. I call it the project database, and I'm going to go to web content, webinf, web.xml, and I'm going to right click that and open with text editor. And here's the same web app tag that we just saw in that web page. So I'm going to paste in there the bit that I copied, which is this resource-ref bit. And the description doesn't matter too much, but this needs to be my database, which again, my database is called Web Shop, and everything else is fine as far as I can see. So I'm going to save that. Now we're going to go to datasource-demo.java, and we're going to add some code that gets the connection. And the first bit that we need to do is we're going to create a object of the type initial context. So I'm going to say here, let's get rid of that comment, initial context, let's call it init context, equals new initial context. Now the stuff that we're going to have to type here is a bit cryptic, but you can just paste it in and forget about it, because you'll probably never have to think about it again. And I'll just do Control-Shift-O there, and this is giving me a exception, and I'm just going to handle that exception. And if I get an exception here, I'm just going to say throw new servlet exception, because you'll see that this init method throws a servlet exception. So let's just throw that out and not worry about it too much. And now we can use this initial context to look up the JNDI data source, and I've no idea actually, to be honest with you, why we have to type the stuff that we do, but I'm going to say init context dot look up, and I'm going to supply a string here that says Java comp stroke env. Now I don't know what that actually is. It seems to be some kind of standard thing, and that's fine for me, and that returns a object, but I'm actually going to cast that object to a thing of type context, which I'll call env, and let's put a cast in there. So this is as cryptic to me as it is to you, but it works, so don't worry about it. And I'll do Control-Shift-O there, and I'll add java.naming.context, and let's just save that, and whoops, I need an equals sign in there as well. Okay, let's see how we go. Okay, that looks good. And now I can use that context to look up my data source. So I say env.lookup, and I supply a string here, JDBC / and my database name, which in my case, because I created a database called web shop, is going to be web shop, so JDBC / web shop, and that returns an object of type data source. So I'm going to say actually let's declare a data source up here. Let's say up here private data source, I think it's capital S, there we go, javax.sql, and let's call that DS, and down here I will say DS equals, and I'll cast this to the right type, data source. And now finally I think we're in business. So that's all the stuff that needs to go in the init method. And by the way, if you want the source code for this, you can find it attached to this series of tutorials. So I'll provide the source code for this so you can look at it as well. And now we've done that, we should be able to actually get a database connection from that data source. And getting the connection is mercifully simple. So we did all that in init, but then in do-get, all we need to do is say connection con equals ds, my data source instance variable, dot get connection. There you go, I told you it was simple. And I'll add the import there, Control-Shift-O, and add java.sql.connection. And I think this throws a SQL exception, so let's handle that, surround with try catch. And I could throw that as a servlet exception or something. Or you could here, you could forward to some error page, for example. But actually, let's just leave that for the moment. Then here you use the connection, and I'm not going to do anything with it for the moment. We'll look at that in a future tutorial. And finally, you can say con.close, and that also, I think it's con.close. Oh yeah, I need to take this outside of the try catch. So let's just copy that out here, because the scope of this is, of course, these two brackets. And I'll set this equal to null. And if I get an exception, I'm just going to return there. And then let's say con.close here, con.close, and save that. And oh, maybe it doesn't throw an exception, it throws a SQL exception. And actually I've got to get rid of this, because this is effectively masking this variable. And now we can handle the exception, so surround with try catch, and there we go. So again, you could go to an error page if you want, if you can't close the connection, but eventually the connection should time out if you're using a data source here. And let's now see, actually before I run this, it would be nice to have some confirmation that it's actually worked. So let's just say out dot, let's say print writer out equals response dot get writer, and out.println connected to database. And let's just save all that, add the import for PrintWriter, save that, and now I should be able to run this. And if this works, I always feel like it's sort of a miracle, but it usually seems to. So if I run this now, and if I've not forgotten anything, then with a bit of luck we're going to see that it's got a database connection. So that's it for this tutorial, and next we're probably going to look at how you deal with getting a data source connection if you're using some kind of internet-based app engine. So that's for next time, and then we're going to go on to look at some kind of database queries that you can do. So join me again next time, and until next time, happy coding.